on state, national, and international assessments, America's students have made little progress in the over 40 years that some of these assessments have been around. Those scores have been mostly stagnant, but more recently, that has begun to change. On the 2018 Program for International Student Assessment, or PISA, for example, the gaps in scores between America's students is growing. And these gaps are worse between students of the same school. And the very recent release of the long-term National Assessment of Educational Progress also confirms these results. We have known for decades that our education system has been ineffective at ensuring every child can meet rigorous standards for learning, but we also know that inequality is growing. For example, we don't yet know what the full implications of COVID-19 will be on inequality in education, but early data is pretty grim. Addressing inequality is precisely what federal education laws intend to do. They provide additional funding to under-resourced schools and, in exchange, ask that states set high academic standards and hold schools accountable for their students meeting those standards. However, the narrow focus on standards, assessment, and accountability as required by federal law created perverse incentives at the school and classroom levels. Naming just two, these included narrowing of the curriculum, meaning that less time was spent on a well-rounded education in favor of more time on reading and math. Then there was teaching to the test, which emphasized getting higher scores on annual assessments rather than genuine learning of content. We know that the entirety of children's progress cannot depend on standards, assessment, and accountability based on a single test alone. But without strong systems for each of these, we won't know if our schools are meeting their educational goals. We also acknowledge and support what the science says, that all children can learn at high levels. So today we want to talk about what kind of assessments and what kind of assessment systems, as well as related practices, are needed to promote high quality teaching and learning in our classrooms. I am joined by 5 panelists for today's discussion. These include Jennifer Randall, Associate Professor in the Research, Educational Measurement, and Psychometrics program at the University of Massachusetts, Krasimir Stakov in the Storytelling Department at Student Voice, Mark Jutabha, School Improvement Facilitator at WestEd, Michael Watson, Vice President of Policy and Advocacy at New Classrooms, and Paul Leather, Partner of Education Policy and State and National Relationships at the Center for Innovation on Education. We have 5 questions to cover today, and we'll leave about 15 minutes at the end for questions from the audience. Closed captioning is available using the captioning button on your screen. And if you have questions for our panel, you can submit them using the Q&A tab on the bottom of your screen or on Twitter using the hashtag #FutureOfTesting. All right, well, let's start by defining what we mean by a well-designed assessment system. So from each of your perspectives, can you define what a well-designed assessment system is and what it would achieve? And how is that different from what most schools have in place today? And I would love for Jennifer to start with a response to that question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Laura, for having me here today and allowing me to engage in this conversation with the other panelists. I would say that a well-designed assessment system would hold equity and justice at the center of all stages, prioritizing the needs and values of the communities in which these assessments operate, especially in minoritized communities. This means from the articulation of the construct, that is the thing that we actually want to measure or assess, to task development, to task administration, finally even to score reporting, all of the impacted stakeholders, especially those who are from marginalized communities, would have to actively engage in the decision-making. And this is regardless of their perceived or actual social and economic power. And not simply engaging in that decision-making, but being encouraged to or trained to, in some cases, to think critically about the assessment development process and the ways in which power and privilege show up in our assessment systems. It would ask questions like, whose values and perspectives and ways of knowing and experiences does the assessment reflect, normalize, and marginalize? And do these assessment results serve to further marginalize people who are already being marginalized within our social systems? What we hope to achieve by doing this through this process would be an assessment that I would say would be fit to teach too. We would have data that actually matters to teachers, to parents, to students, and the communities where they live. We might lose, perhaps, hopefully, the well-earned contempt many of these stakeholders have for our current assessment system. But instead, what we have right now is what I say is really a commitment to maintaining the white supremacist hegemony, with assessment systems denying the existence of race altogether through these so-called colorblind and neutral approaches to developing assessments, which really only serve to perpetuate the inequities that already exist. Speaking as a former social studies teacher, every large-scale elementary, middle school social studies exam that I've ever had the privilege of taking a look at had questions on it that really idolized whiteness. For example, this notion that our founding fathers are brilliant and wonderful and that they saved our great land from ruin. They also have items that tend to dehumanize or erase other marginalized groups. For example, indigenous peoples are represented as either savages or stupid or simply not represented at all. And Black slaves are represented as pathetic and helpless. In all cases, on these assessments, whiteness is protected. And my kingdom for an assessment task that would force students to interrogate how the great writer of the Declaration of Independence was also and could be a slaveholder and a rapist. I guess what I'm saying, I think, is that if our goal with the educational assessment systems is to maintain white supremacist logics and to protect whiteness at all costs, then what we have is already beautifully and perfectly designed to do that. If our goal, however, is for assessments to promote or serve equity and justice, we have considerable work to do. Because what we have right now is a watered down, unengaged assessment process that fails to serve most students, and I argue even students from white dominant culture suffer.
Thank you. Mark, I'd love for you to respond to that, but also add your response to the overall question.
I think, Jennifer, thank you for kicking us off. We at West Ed, from a systems perspective, we believe a well-designed assessment system is one that intentionally balances the use of formative, interim benchmark, and summative assessment practices. It's designed to support a site's theory of learning to improve student performance. This type of system is at the heart of the MTSS, the multi-tiered system of support, which uses a decision to tree approach to answer 1, what's been taught, and then 2, to what degree it's been learned, and how to use these points in a coherent approach to assist in streamlining decisions at all levels of the system. So by that, I mean classroom, teacher, school, district, and so on. More so with formative assessments. Right? Our current work leans more into the formative practices with the entire lesson cycle. For example, the balance approach I talk about goes beyond the typical paper, pencil, computer quiz test at a lesson's conclusion, but utilizes more formative practices for the before, during, and after instruction. Namely, what do I need to know about my scholars before I teach? What specifically am I looking for from them during the lesson? And to what degree have my scholars mastered the learning objective? And how will I adjust moving forward? The system we describe is not much different from what we see in the sites that we work with. The challenge we see is that systems struggling to tie it all together through a viable balance between instruction and assessment. Again, opposed to the more common reality of teach, 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 then formally assess via some type of assessment at the end.
So before I have Michael respond, I think what I'm also hearing the both of you having just said is that when we talk about assessments, we cannot just talk about them in a vacuum because they are part of a system of teaching and learning. And they essentially value what students ought to have learned, but they may not reflect what students had learned. So I'm just going to kind of point out sort of what I heard was in common, and we can talk more about that later. But Michael, you're up next.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Laura. Congratulations to you and the center. I want to acknowledge this significant work that you and your team have done in bringing to light this very timely and important issue. As you just said, and appreciate the comments, we currently have an assessment system with many of the requirements that are still came to light during No Child Left Behind that really cemented the role of high stakes assessment as the primary measure of school performance. And rather than that system being an after the fact measure, these tests unfortunately have become the drivers of what should be taught and when, and your report rightly calls some of this out. But those tests themselves were never really designed to drive instruction, just to assess performance, and appreciate what Mark just said about that. So we have this continuing problem. And that problem does not promote equitable practices. Your report's so notable because it really does shed light on new ways to really think differently about designing assessment systems to not only reduce the amount of time to administer assessments, but really to ensure that it collects student information throughout the year. And I think that's a major shift from where we are right now and how things could be different moving forward. But that only works if we're able to finally incorporate ways of supporting the measurement of instruction. The assessments themselves can change, but assessments that could help in achieving more students being college and career ready cannot happen independent of instruction change. So we actually need to take some time to think about the best thinking that's out there around new ways to drive teaching and learning, and combine that with assessment practices, both the formative, the interim, and summative assessments. And I can talk more about this later in the presentation, but I think this is how assessments need to change moving forward.
Great. So I think, let's see, Kresimir, we want you up next.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Jennifer, what you said, a lot of that was just on the nose. Testing and assessment more broadly really does uphold a system that's fundamentally unjust. And we see that not only in what students are asked to know on the test, but also in the way that we end up employing those tests against students and against marginalized communities to further marginalize them. And I know, Michael, you touched on this in terms of high stakes testing as something that affects not only students, but also communities more broadly. When we look at students taking tests in third grade and fifth grade throughout middle and high school, that determine whether or not they're going to be taking advanced classes, general classes, or remedial classes. Often those tests are some of the only real weighing factors, not how teachers are seeing those students in the classroom, not how students and parents see their own needs and capacities. And as a result, we're really seeing a system that keeps pushing students out if they don't already fit into the current white supremacist unjust system. And I think that really, when we look at testing more broadly in this context, we know that we have to move away from this high stakes pressuring testing, that as using assessment as just one tool of many in conjunction with teacher evaluations, in conjunction with student self-evaluations, collaborative methods, and more holistic approaches, so that we're not looking at one test or at a series of tests, even as the ultimate end-all be-all when we look at assessment.
And I think I'm next, Laura, if I'm not mistaken. So I would just also join the others in thanking you, Laura, and the Center for American Progress for highlighting the issue of assessment and the great need for innovation. And also want to thank Jennifer for her powerful opener, really casting light on this image of assessment as being independent, neutral, and above context. Context means so much. In terms of well-designed assessment systems versus what schools have in place today, I really think it really needs to be balanced in terms of assessments need to be coherent both vertically and horizontally in terms of K through 12, as well as connection to curriculum instruction and assessment. It should be comprehensive in that it addresses both the breadth and depth of learning that is expected. It should provide continuity of student results over time and have identified utility. It should be testing for a purpose, and the purpose should be understood. At the same time, it needs to be efficient and not take up too much of the learning time. And I think that many would argue, certainly folks on this panel, that it should be loosely coupled at best, that the state system of assessments, meaning that it is not driven by those assessments, but should be connected through standards to common learning expectations, and not be controlled by the one ring that rules them all, the large scale state assessment.
So each of you, I think, has talked a little bit about how the current annual assessments are used, and it has, I would argue, been unintended largely, but it has happened nonetheless, where schools that have very low resources to begin with then are labeled as failing, or have been labeled as failing, and there can be sort of a shame and blame that happens with when their assessment results are given to them, or they're input into an accountability system, which gets me to the next question, that assessments are really only as good as they are used for the correct purpose. So Michael, I'd love for you to speak a bit about what are the correct uses of assessment results by students, by parents, teachers, district administrators, and even state and federal policymakers in order to really drive the learning forward. How should assessments be used to achieve that purpose?
Great, thanks, Laura. I love the history lesson that your series provides on how we got here and how stakeholders see use, and really appreciate Jennifer and Cressmer's comments, focused on community and community denial and a need for better community action. As your paper noted, 2 decades ago, new civil rights education law was designed to be inclusive and responsive and fair, and centered on 4 areas of concentration. And you named 3 of them: standards, assessment, and accountability. But there was a 4th, which again was instruction. What also happened at that time is that quickly decisions were made to focus on the first 3 and leave teaching and learning, instruction as a measurement and indicator, driven at the local level, thus losing out on early designs in terms of how students grow and learn on a daily basis. And we're still paying the price for that mistake today, and have a disconnected policy and practitioner system, which has always created this tension and challenges. And certainly Paul and I know this as 2 individuals who used to run assessment teams in our respective states, around the correct need and use of summative assessments from all the stakeholders that you mentioned. I said before, meaningful change cannot happen independent of meaningful instruction change. Today's NAEP or yesterday's NAEP results are really reinforcing this, and we need a new instructional models coupled with an assessment system that really complements this. What parents and teachers and communities are saying is that there continues to be this large disconnect in the system. During COVID, the majority of parents for the first time were able to really see under the hood of what was happening in classrooms, and they did not like what they saw. In fact, a significant majority of teachers believe schools need to be more innovative generally. Public Impact found that 67% of Black parents, for example, want schools to really rethink how they educate students, and that includes assessment. I also saw just last week that only 1 in 5 communities were asked anything about the ARP plans that all states had to submit to the U.S. Department of Education. So there's another example of just parent denial and not even parent access to really influence the funds that are designed to really look into learning loss and promote perhaps new ways to think about assessment and accountability as well as instruction. Lake Research came out with something a few weeks ago. 3/4 of likely voters say a lack of personalized learning coupled with a lack of assessment systems to support that is a real problem. So, you know, your report really speaks to these issues, that there's an opportunity to do things really different, but this current assessment system continues to thwart that type of thinking. And, you know, I think we've started to make the shift, and you know, there's some examples both in the paper in Georgia and Nebraska where students are now presented with a mix of pre-grade, on-grade, above-grade standards. I think communities are relatively supportive of that. I tried to apply some of this thinking in Delaware with our science assessments connected to the new standards, as well as these kits that we were managing at the state level. And the concept of those designs are really simple, right? Like develop tests that are administered throughout the year and aggregate results of some of those questions into a summative score. I think it's a great start. I'd also just say, and I want to make sure that there's time for others to speak. Imagine if it was more than this. You know, as you noted in your third report in this series, there are new novel ways that we can push even further. Innovative learning models designed to meet students exactly where they are in their zone of proximal development, not too easy and not too hard, can really focus more precisely on competency. That coupled with an assessment design where students are mastering and then being evaluated both at the local level formatively, as well as potentially some state item questions that are there to validate, could be a very different way of thinking about assessment that's more closely tied and coupled to the individual needs of each student and driven in a way that both provides policymakers what they need, as well as individual schools and teachers and communities as well.
So, Paul, how do we get to the assessment system we seem to be rallying around, which is one, it's anti-racist and uplifting of student experiences in their community. It's personalized. It's also challenging to students. How do we get to that kind of system? What are the challenges that you see in getting to that sort of ideal goal? And what I described was incomplete, but that was just what I've been hearing from this discussion so far.
Well, actually, and I wasn't prepared to talk to that question, Laura, but since you asked, we've actually been doing some work in Kentucky recently where we've been asking that question of students and of families and parents, as well as community members, as to what do they need from their education system. We've asked that question across the state, and now we're starting a similar process of asking the question right in communities, and then looking to design both the assessment and the accountability system in ways that are directly responsive to what both students and families are asking for, and in particular, those students and families that don't typically get an opportunity to actually respond or be a part of the system design. So this inclusive design process really brings us to a whole different place where we start to look at student identity and how a student feels they fit not just in the school, but in the larger community, and how the school can help support them as they grow and develop. So I guess that would be how I would start to approach new kinds of designs that would really help us break out of the current mode that we've been thinking about for the last 20, 30 years that haven't gotten us the results we were looking for anyway, as you pointed out, with both the national and the international assessments.
So staying with that, Paul, can you talk about what your approach was in New Hampshire and how you were trying to innovate there at the state level in terms of assessments and what that meant for teaching and learning, right? Because we brought that topic up over and over again, that we can't just talk about assessments in a vacuum. They're part of a teaching and learning system. They're part of a school community. They're part of a broader community. So how have you tried to innovate at the state level in terms of assessments?
Well, I think it really is at the very beginning, we need to think about power and control. When the state commissioner or a state superintendent or even the deputy commissioner, like I was, walks in the room, the level of discussion drops. And so everyone looks to me or to anyone in those formal positions for the answer. So the first thing that needs to happen is to really disrupt that issue of power and control, and to create really a learning circle, a learning community where folks can listen and hear from one another, and where everyone's voice has an opportunity. So when we were designing PACE, we put people in circles and asked them to speak about what would be most meaningful to them. We didn't come in with a predetermined answer, and we looked to try to build and design the system in ways that would be responsive to what people were finding as needs. I don't think we went far enough because we only asked educators. I think the learning that we've had since that time is we need to be speaking with students. We need to be speaking with families. We need to be speaking with citizens. We need to be speaking with everyone in the community because they know what they want from their school system, and they know what school systems need to be held accountable to.
So I want to pick up a point, the notion of power and control, right? And states, essentially, they govern the education system within the state. They make a lot of choices. They don't make them all, but they make a fair amount of choices, including how the assessment systems are designed. Jennifer, you are training the next generation of psychometricians. Those are the scientists who develop assessments. How are you training your students to think more innovatively and to integrate these ideas of teaching and learning and power dynamics and community and anti-racism? Like, what does that look like in terms of training that next generation?
Yeah, so I think it's multi-part. So in addition to being in a measurement program and training psychometricians, I also teach pre-service teachers just in our education program. I teach an anti-racist assessment course because I think any changes that we'll see will have to happen broadly and across many groups of people, right? So in addition to what the people on the pedagogical side of the house, I think teacher education programs have already been doing for decades the work around anti-racist instruction and around culturally sustaining instruction. Gloria Ladson-Billings, Elam Parrish-Jangle, all of these people have been doing that work. And so educators are getting that experience. They know what the instruction looks like, not necessarily what the assessment looks like that's attached to that instruction. And there's a huge disconnect there, right? So they're doing this great work in the classroom, and then we nearly traumatize their students with this very standardized, decontextualized assessment that we flop down in front of them, which discourages them from doing the work because then their schools are labeled as failing. And it's hard to break up that cycle. So even with teachers, I'm about, okay, how do you make your assessments in your classroom space map back to these instructional practices? Because quite frankly, that's the assessment that students experience every day, right? Is what happens in the classroom space, not that assessment that they take in the spring. But at the same time, that assessment in the spring should also have anti-racist principles, right? So it's really training psychometricians to think about how do we interrogate these large-scale tests to make sure that they don't just privilege whiteness. And in what ways can we use these assessments to be more effective? I feel like, Michael, when you talked about this notion of aggregating these series of formative assessments along the way, to me, I feel like that's an innovation we really need to explore more in psychometrics. How can we make that happen? Because the purpose of any assessment should be to inform instructional decisions first and foremost. That should be primary. You can have other secondary and tertiary purposes, and I'm fine with that no matter what it is. But the primary focus, at least at K-12, should be to be informing instructional decisions. And how can you inform instructional decisions if the test is just given at the end of the academic year and they get the results back 7 months later and those students have moved on to a different teacher and a different situation? So if we could, figure out a way to get the feedback faster, for the assessment itself to be fit to be putting before marginalized students, period. And then using that data and sharing it with communities and then engaging in communities around what does this data actually mean, right? So measurement folks, psychometricians need to figure out how to actually engage with communities, which might mean everyone engaging in some professional development about how to talk to each other and how to really think critically about this, because it's not enough just to slap a test in front of a parent and be like, tell me what you think about this. Because if they haven't been trained to critically interrogate what you put before them, then they're just going to say, well, this just looks like the same crap you gave me 25 years ago. My kid will endure it the same way I endured it. And again, that doesn't address the problem. So I think it's about who are the classroom teachers? How do we train them to think about how to be anti-racist, which is what I do every day every week in my classes. And then also in the measurement classes, how do we get measurement folks to start to think more creatively around what it is, what can we do?
So I want to pick up on, I want to do 2 more points and then we might have so we're going to leave some time for questions. So because you mentioned it, Jennifer, I want to ask this question of Mark. Assessment literacy, what does that mean? And how are you building that with the teachers that you work with day in and day
out? Thanks, Laura. So when we talk about assessment literacy, it's, do teachers understand question types, select the response, construct a response? Do they understand how to, on the fly, adjust for rigor? This question in the textbook does not fit my current needs or my student identity. How can I quickly and rapidly adjust to what they need and not sacrifice comparability, variability, and reliability? In terms of, sorry, what was your second part?
And how are you building assessment literacy in the teachers that you work with every day, the PD that you provide, professional development?
Gotcha. It's leaning heavily into advocating for student identity, agency, and efficacy. So getting teachers to understand assessments is not something done to students. Getting students to understand assessment, this is not done to you. It's done with you to assist you on your continuing trajectory in education and learning. Right. So what we're trying to cut the cord on is you, the student, your worth, your value as a learner is not dependent solely on this score or this metric or this proficiency level. It's simply a point in time using other various sources of data to inform what we need to do in this moment as close to real time as instruction as possible to move learning forward.
Got it. Yeah. So this next question is for Krasimir. So students have come up a couple of times, and at least in my experience, student voice, no pun intended, has been missing in terms of what kind of assessment systems do we want to build? What do students want to know? How do students use this information? Like, I think we talk about that theoretically, but when it comes to policy and practice, I'm not sure that we execute on that. So how can we advocate for the kinds of assessments and the practices that we want, especially when it comes to the student experience of assessment?
Yeah, definitely. I think you're right on in saying that those who experience testing most directly, students and teachers, their lived experience really gives them a unique expertise when we talk about testing. They know best what has to change within the system. And so as a result, we really do need to center both the students and teachers in advocacy efforts. Of course, that's not to say that, every other party involved, families, administrators, practitioners, policymakers, and other community members shouldn't be involved. In fact, we need them more than ever for a full community push. But when we talk about this advocacy, students and teachers really do have a unique role, and their voices should be at the forefront. We know that students already have the capacity and the energy for this type of policy organizing because we've seen students repeatedly do it, especially in the last few years. When the COVID-19 pandemic disrupted traditional models of standardized testing, we saw students call for test blind and test optional college admissions practices, including Student Voice's Test Optional Now campaign, and that led to policy changes at the university and state levels across the United States. And at a smaller but equally impactful level, we've seen students push College Board, the testing organization, directly for changes on advanced placement testing that better suit their needs. And we've seen organizing at the district level to change mandates about SAT and ACT testing requirements. In short, we see that students have the capacity, and it's up to us to uplift the stories of students whom traditional testing methodologies have failed. We need to open up the space for students to really reimagine testing, to lead with their models, and to work across generations and power systems to create assessments that work for everyone. And in terms of the relationship there with adults, we need adults to create the scaffolding for those conversations to happen in the classroom, at the district level in education, and more broadly. Teachers and administrators need to collaborate with students, not only to solicit feedback or interpretations, but really to co-create the models of assessment that will be going forward. This does need to be a collaborative process, as Jennifer's pointed out, really from the beginning of what are we assessing to the very end product, and students need to be involved in all of that. Teachers similarly understand the burden of assessment practices as they stand currently on instruction time, on student relationships, and the way that those practices often fail to see what they see in the classroom every day in terms of their students' potential and growth. So when we look at who are we listening to in these conversations, students and teachers need to drive these conversations, which I think makes it all the more easy to integrate other components like family members, because students are involved, then they're much more likely to bring their family along with them. And just a final note kind of on this advocacy front, a lot of testing is wrapped up in federal mandates and ESSA, but as we've pointed out, there's a lot of opportunities for change at the state, local, and even classroom level. And so we need a full system push when we talk about this advocacy. It can't just be at the federal level, at the state level. This needs to be a holistic approach that really targets testing at every level.
So really quickly, Krasimir noted that the policy is driven by feds, and just to level set for everyone, what the federal law called the Every Student Succeeds Act requires is one annual assessment in reading, language, arts, and math in grades 3 through 8, and once in high school. So just making sure everybody knows. But Mark, I think you wanted to pick up on a point that was just made.
Yes, thanks. To build off what Krasimir and Paul and the panel are leveraging, this trend of active student voice. So one of the routes that my team is working on is leveraging culturally responsive, sustaining education practices to bring in student beliefs and identities. And one way to do that is, again, exposing them to multiple types of assessments, bringing in their belief systems, their identities in this process. Students have to see, they need to see themselves in the assessments and the lessons and tasks. Another quick way to do it is choice, right? At the instructional level, whenever possible in a resource or text, allowing students to choose topics or work in the modalities that connect to them and are relevant to them. Simple approaches like choice boards or project-based assessments can help teachers double or even triple down their work. Like I can grow student agency efficacy at the same time as gaining familiarity with and engaging in various topics and question types. And at the same time, I can engage my students with multiple levels of rigor.
Yeah, I think what we all seem to be rallying around is we need to really look at the power and control where that is seated right now in designing our teaching and learning systems, our assessment systems, and how that devalues communities, how it devalues students, and frankly, just take a completely new approach. And I've got to say, it's incredibly different than what we have, and I think it'll be a huge challenge getting there. But what we're doing right now isn't working. So I think we've got to be open to doing something differently. We've got a lot of questions from the audience, so I'm going to pivot over to that, and I'm going to not assign this to anyone. So whoever would like to speak first, please go ahead. And what I have here is, what are the top 3 shifts that must occur and for whom for better assessments and assessment practices to be realized in our classrooms? One more again. What are the top 3 shifts that must occur and for whom for better assessments and assessment practices to be realized in our classrooms?
So I don't know if I can come up with a top 3. Or at least I could, but I feel like it would take me some time to decide what's the top 3. But I do think a big shift that needs to happen, because we know that large-scale assessment drives instruction. It shouldn't, but we know it does. And until such time as we all move to bizarro world, it will continue to do so. So the goal has to be, even as I work with classroom teachers, for us to shift large-scale assessments and what they look like. So they have to be culturally sustaining. They have to be anti-racist. And in order for that to happen, states must demand that vendors provide them with those assessments. Otherwise, vendors won't do it, right? So if you don't write into your RFP states that you want them to demonstrate how the assessment is in fact anti-racist, in the same way that you have to demonstrate how an assessment adheres to universal design principles, if that's not written into the RFP, the vendor won't do it because they're going to do the thing that they're going to get paid to do. And developing culturally sustaining and anti-racist assessments right now will likely cost more money because you would have to be doing something different, and different cost money, but also a fear that if they do it and the state doesn't want it, the state will toss it back at them. So for me, a major shift has to be the people who make the decisions at the state level about what the assessments look like at the end, those summative assessments, and even the interim assessment systems that they buy, right? Because many states buy these interim assessment systems, that they be culturally sustaining and anti-racist. To me, I think if we can get that shift, then even teachers who aren't interested in teaching in a culturally sustaining and anti-racist way, and let's be real, there are plenty who do not, and maybe I spend too much time on TikTok listening to these teachers, but they do exist. They will shift if that large-scale assessment is anti-racist and culturally sustaining, because they don't want to be rated as failing. So to me, just that change will shift us in the right direction.
Michael, you're up.
Yeah, Jennifer, thanks for that. I mean, I'd also add to that, one of the top concerns that I continue to have, particularly in certain communities that, just continue to feel frustrated the way that the current summative assessment sort of beats them down year after year after year, is that we're not measuring holistic learning growth. It's just not been part of the conversation. ESSA tried to give a nod and a wink toward it. But at the end of the day, the same 33 items that are used on the summative assessment that are just driven at the grade level are also then being utilized in ways that then try to create these growth methodologies and metrics, which aren't terribly well understood. They're not usable at the school level to demonstrate or understand holistic learning growth. And kids get demoralized and don't get credit because they continue to, it doesn't really translate to how students are performing individually. They were never, it's growth measures were never really designed for that. It was designed for Paul and me to say, okay, look, I'm taking $20 million and utilizing it this way, did it have an impact in terms of how students are performing as a result? So, for me, it's one of the big shifts, the sort of non-negotiables, is that we have to start measuring pre-grade, on-grade, above learning growth in meaningful ways, coupled with what Jennifer indicated, that and I think building a system that really is responsive in that way, and really meeting students where they are and helping them get where they need to go, and designing them in such a way that teachers don't feel the burden of, I've got to get, the average fifth grade classroom. There was some research that came out from NWEA like a year and a half ago that gives tests to 10 million students with the MAP growth assessment. And they found that the average fifth grade classroom has kids in 7 different grade levels. Like, let's just acknowledge that that's a reality right now, and then start to build systems of support where the question's no longer, let's expose students to college ready standards, and let's instead start focusing on when mastery will occur for every student based on where they are in their learning journey. The challenge we have a system, a factory model that we continue to promote and tweak. The evidence in the NAEP results that just came out yesterday have indicated that not only are we stagnating, we're actually getting worse. And it's time that we need to reorient the entire system and start thinking differently and listen to parents and communities. That doesn't mean throw away assessments. Summative assessments are really important, but we need to design them in a way that really works for communities, because having 1/3 of students graduating college and career ready, and of those 1/3 of students, 6% of them are Black males, is just not acceptable. 80% of Hispanic males going into community colleges having to go into remediation courses is just not acceptable. And yet we keep hoping that by changing ESEA and that somehow magically the system will change. And I think we need to take some, have some serious conversations about the reality of where we are and start thinking about what equity really means for kids.
Yeah, to build on what the panel is saying, in terms of shifts, I'll take it to a more granular level, classroom level, looking at how teachers communicate the uses of assessments, more towards, to my students, I care about you and your success. These concepts are important. I will be relentless in my support to support you. We're not there yet. And not, you need to be at this proficiency level. You're not working hard enough, right? These messages negate student agency and take the life out of student learning. We need to the shift of actively engaging the students, right? Helping them build an assessment identity so that they come to the following understanding. If I, the student, find value in teaching an assessment, then it's relevant. If it's relevant to me, I'll be more resilient when I run into challenges. And then if I'm resilient when I take charge of my learning, then I become unstoppable as a continuous learner.
Paul, I'm going to call you out. I think you have thoughts on this.
Yeah, I would just add that part of the problem now is that the field of building assessments, particularly at the state level, has really not caught up with what's being demanded. What's being demanded are assessments that are contextually appropriate to where students and where families and where communities are right now, and to build a system independent of those contexts is just no longer relevant. And so that lack of relevance is what we hear about all the time coming from users of the system. So this issue of utility, these systems need to be designed by the folks who use them, and the folks who actually construct the systems need to understand how to be inclusive in that design process.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and add that I think when we kind of go back to this original question of what shifts need to occur in order for the actual policy changes to happen, I think one of the most core ones is that we need to start listening to the people who are doing poorly under the standard assessment systems. Because right now, what we're seeing is that, for example, I've had a lot of advantages in the education system. I am white. My family is engaged in my education system. I grew up in a family that was able to financially support me. And so when I did well on assessments, that was expected. And when I spoke out against assessments and assessment practices, that was respected because I did well under the current system, but I still opposed them. But when students who are disturbed by these practices, who know best what's wrong with the system, say, I see something wrong here. This isn't working for me. This isn't working for our community. And let's name it, those students are typically Black, they're typically low income, they're typically differently abled. When those students speak out against assessment practices that are not treating them fairly, they are dismissed because, oh, you're shifting the blame. You are looking for a different excuse. Well, you're just not at the level that we want you to be at. And in order for us to implement policy practices that truly include students who are currently marginalized, we need to be listening to them when they tell us that something's going wrong. And so that needs to be a behavioral shift when we look at who's actually implementing the policies to ensure that we are reaching out to those communities for feedback and legitimating it.
Paul, can you speak to why there might be a slowness or a hesitancy or just barrier to states listening to their teachers and students or other constituencies that are calling for change in their assessment systems? Why might they hesitate to do so?
Absolutely, Laura. I would just say that I've had this conversation with state superintendents and assessment directors all around the country as we've talked about innovative assessment. And the conversation essentially goes like this. So they'll say, so I think I have a new idea that is supported by folks in my communities and others in the state. I really want to know, can we actually do this? And I tell them, yes, I think we can actually do it. And then they'll ask, so how much time do I have to develop, prototype, and pilot new assessment systems? And I'll say, well, under the current federal law, if you want to do something innovative outside of what you're currently doing, you have about 5 years to do that. And they'll say, well, maybe that's kind of short, but are there resources to support that work? And I'll have to say, there really aren't the resources to do it. There are no monies attached to the Innovative Assessment Demonstration Authority. There are some competitive grants you can apply for, but there's no there's no way that we can say you'll actually receive them. And so then they'll go on and ask, well, if I do in fact go through this and create a system that's new and innovative, is there any what's the likelihood the U.S. Department of Education will actually approve it? And I say, well, unfortunately, you have to deal with this peer review process that U.S. Department of Education has that is tied to the current large-scale state assessment model. And it's really hard to get through that system. So if they're still talking to me after that, then we start to get into comparability conversations and how the pilot districts are selected and how you can compare the results of the existing assessment to the new assessment, even if you're trying to assess something different like a profile of a graduate. So it's a very tough right now. It's a tough environment to try to move forward into innovation. And that's why so few have actually stepped forward. There are some courageous leaders, but those pathfinders are few and far between when you look at state commissioners and you look at state assessment directors.
So Paul was just mentioning some of the barriers that are in current federal law as well as policy out of the department, which I address in the third report. So one, there is an authority, there's an allowance for states to be able to create new assessment systems that was built into this current reauthorization of the Every Student Succeeds Act. And it creates some stipulations, and it says, You have to use your piloted test within 5 years. You have to commit to that, and you have to use it statewide. And then there are some technical requirements within the law, but also within regulations that essentially say your piloted designs kind of have to look the same. Technically speaking, they kind of have to look the same as current tests. And in particular, there's this concept of comparability. And what that means is you have to be able to compare the scores from one student to another, or one district to another, to be able to say, this is how all kids were doing, this is how some kids did, because you have a consistent measure of the score. Now, what I also talked about in those papers is that you can get a little creative. The technical ability is out there, but the policy doesn't support this, where you could have comparability of the construct, meaning the knowledge, skill, or ability that you are intending to measure. You can have that be comparable across an assessment, but still allow for the scores to vary a little bit. And then you could also use something called a concordance table, where you're able to create equivalent scores between different administrations of that test. And it's similar to what colleges do right now. If they accept both the SAT and the ACT, they can tell you, and this is just a random example, this isn't exact, they can tell you a 19 on the ACT is equivalent to a 1200 on the SAT, for example. So there are ways that you can build a test that give you a little bit more flexibility in how that test is designed. But you could still compare. And you could, frankly, I think, get more accurate measures of what students know and can do. It's just the policy doesn't currently support it. So those were some of the challenges that Paul was talking about, as well as the pilot that is in current law. It didn't come with any money. So if states are going to pilot these new designs, they got to pay out of pocket, these are very expensive ventures. So it's no surprise that not many states did. So we've only got 2 more minutes. We have more questions and we can answer, but let's see, Michael, this was for you. New classrooms identify a critical education problem in missing fundamentals for students entering middle school. The problem is that schools in impoverished areas have the least qualified teachers or effective teachers. The proposed comprehensive remedial approach to deficiencies is impressive but complex. How are these problems overcome in Delaware?
Well, they're not being overcome in Delaware right now. I'm here in Delaware, but New Classrooms as an organization is currently in 14 states, and we work with marginalized communities as a core of our mission. And so there's a great study that I would encourage everybody to look at that was done, an independent study by Margrady Research, that was supported by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which really showed that students who are entering within the 13th percentile and were given the flexibility and freedom in Chicago, in North Chicago, 90% free and reduced lunch, 100% Black population, who were really far behind when they entered 6th grade. Because Chicago was evaluating teachers on comprehensive and holistic learning growth, teachers and the principals really took on the notion of let's take these 3 years and work really hard to get students to get caught up. So students were being met every single day in their zone of proximal development. Daily assessments were given to those students to determine where they were in their learning journey on that day and where they needed to go next. And it was personalized and individualized. And at the end of those 3 years, the students, their growth rates were phenomenal. In fact, when you show that to researchers, because some of the students were in the 65th percentile or the 75th percentile, they said, this is impossible. You can't move students from the 13th percentile to the 75th percentile. But when we actually design systems that go beyond 8 months of instruction and put the pressure on one individual teacher to solve for that, and you design a system where all teachers are working together over 3 years and have that support, where they're not staying up until 2 in the morning on Pinterest trying to find materials to differentiate instruction, you create a whole community and culture where everybody's achieving, and it's supportive of teachers as well, particularly through coaching and providing them with the supports that they need so they can do what they do best, which is teach.
It takes resources and intention. is what I'm hearing from that. We've gone a little bit over time. Unfortunately, we can't continue this webinar. We have so many questions. I will commit to following up on them on a separate avenue. And yes, to those who asked if this recording will be available online, it absolutely will. Thank you all so much for your time and the rich discussion. Have a wonderful day. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.